And so the disciples, of course, think that Jesus is talking about literally he's asleep. And so they're like, Jesus, we're not medical experts. But if the dude's sleeping, let him sleep. He'll get better. Everyone knows when you're sick, and especially when you've had a prolonged illness, when you finally get some rest, when you finally start to get some sleep that's uninterrupted, that's a sign that you're starting to get better. That's a really good thing. You should let him sleep. And so they tell him that in verse 12, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get well. It's not hard, Jesus. Just trust us on this one. But verse 13, however, Jesus spoke of his death, but they thought he was speaking about taking rest in sleep. The disciples don't understand what Jesus is telling them. And there's times in life where we don't always understand what God's trying to tell us. There's times where it's not always clear what he has to say to us, or we read something in the Bible and we're just like, I don't fully get what this means. And the disciples are having that moment with Jesus where they're missing what Jesus is trying to tell them. Then in verse 14, Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead. Jesus, when he tells them that Lazarus has been asleep and that he's going to wake him up, he's trying to tell them, hey, I have the power to resurrect Lazarus from the dead back to life. It's this beautiful, powerful promise that Jesus is saying, this wonderful thing that he wants to do for Lazarus and one day will do for each of us as well. But they miss it because they think they understand things better than Jesus. So they miss what Jesus is really trying to tell them. And sometimes that happens for us when we become so convinced we know what's going on. We become so convinced we know what life's about, what we need to do, what needs to happen, that sometimes we miss the bigger, better things that God's trying to do, that God's trying to tell us about life, about who he is. And then Jesus says something very strange in verse 15. And I am glad for your sake that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. Jesus tells them Lazarus is dead, and then he says, and I'm glad I wasn't there. They knew Jesus could heal people who are sick. So why is Jesus glad that he wasn't there? This almost sounds like Jesus is cold, like Jesus doesn't really care. But that's not true, because later in the chapter, Jesus goes with the disciples, and when they go to the tomb of Lazarus and they see him, and when Jesus is talking with the family, and when he sees the people weeping over Lazarus, and he sees the tomb where Lazarus is laying in, the simplest, shortest, but also possibly the most profound verse in all the Bible, John 11:35, it says, Jesus wept. Jesus knows he's about to go raise Lazarus from the dead. He knows that this is a temporary thing, that Lazarus is only going to be dead for a few days and he's going to be raised back to life. And when Jesus weeps, it's a few moments before he's going to raise Lazarus back to life. But Jesus weeps because he has empathy, because he has sympathy for other people, because he sees the bigger picture, that he knows life was never meant to be something that had suffering and illness, where people hurt each other, where people got sick and died. This was not his original plan. This is not his plan for the world originally when he created the world. But that because of sin, because of us choosing to fight against God in our lives, choosing to live life not his way all the time, that all these terrible things have entered life because of that. So Jesus weeps because Jesus cares about us, has compassion on us, even when some of the mistakes we make were brought on by ourselves. He still loves us. When he sees Lazarus weeping, when he sees the sorrow that it's causing his friends, Jesus weeps with them. And when Jesus sees us in our lives, when he sees us go through things, when he sees us have a relationship fall apart, when he sees us lose our job, when he sees us get a failing grade in school, when he sees us get in trouble, when he sees us get sick, when he sees us die, he has compassion on us. He feels those things with us. He loves us. He has compassion on us. He weeps over our pain, and he feels it as well himself. And so even though Jesus sees the bigger picture, he still weeps over us. Even though he knows he's going to make all things right in the end, it doesn't stop him from feeling in the moment the same pain that we feel. So Jesus wept. So why then, in verse 15, why then is he saying that I'm glad that I wasn't there? Why is there a part of Jesus, even though he's weeping over the loss of his friend, why is there a part of Jesus that's glad that he wasn't there to protect Lazarus, wasn't there to end Lazarus' illness and to heal him before his death? It's because Jesus sees the bigger picture. It's because he knows that what he's about to do in going to raise Lazarus from the dead is going to give the disciple the faith in him that they need. It's going to give them the courage and hope that they need in their lives. Because when they see Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead, all of them know that Jesus can do the same thing for them whenever it is that they die. And all of us can have the same hope that if Jesus can raise Lazarus from the dead, that Jesus, when he comes again one day, can raise each of us from the dead who've passed away. It's the greatest hope of all, that Jesus brings life out of death. And so Jesus says, I'm glad I wasn't there so that you may grow in your belief. And he says, nevertheless, let us go to him. So it's time for us to go. You guys are missing what I'm about to do. You don't understand what I'm telling you. I'm going to have to show you. So just come with me and you'll see. And then Thomas in verse 16. Then Thomas, who's called Didymus, which means the twin, Thomas the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go so that we may die with him. Thomas is convinced that they're not going to bring life to this situation. He's convinced, like, hey, the religious leaders, they were just trying to kill us a few days ago, last time we were here. If we go back to where Lazarus is really close to where Jerusalem is, where all the religious leaders, where their capital, their hub is. If we go back there, they're going to try to kill us again. And this time, I think they're going to be successful. And the thing is, he's right. A few days after Jesus goes to raise Lazarus from the dead, he's going to go into Jerusalem for the last time, and he's going in there for the purpose of giving his life to die on our behalf. So Thomas is right, that if they go to where Lazarus is, if they go with Jesus, Jesus is going to die, and they're going to try to kill the disciples. And over the rest of their lives, many of the disciples are killed for their faith in Jesus. They do, most of them, die the death of a martyr. And yet, even though Thomas is convinced that they're going there to die, he still thinks it's worth going because he gets Jesus. He may not understand everything that Jesus says. There might be things Jesus says that go over his head or that confuse him. He doesn't always get everything about Jesus. He doesn't get everything about what Jesus is doing, but he gets the big picture of who Jesus is. He gets that Jesus is the Son of God, that Jesus is the one who's going to make all things right in the world. And he would rather go and risk his life with Jesus, die with Jesus, than to live his life apart from Jesus. Because Jesus is beautiful. Because Jesus is wonderful. And later, his faith in Jesus is rewarded because he sees Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead. And about a week or so later, Jesus dies and gets risen from the dead 3 days after his own death. And Thomas gets to see Jesus risen from the dead, and he's rewarded for his faith in Jesus by getting to see the miraculous power of who Jesus is. And so Thomas says, let us go with him, even if we die with him, it's still worth it. And that same invitation is not just for those disciples right there with him, but it's for all disciples of Jesus for the future as well. It's for each of us. That invitation is extended to us that we can go with Jesus. Even if our lives die, even if it's a hard life, even if we end up dying for our faith, Jesus can resurrect us from the dead, and one day he promises he will come back to raise us from the dead. I remember one time going on a Pathfinder camping trip, and was there Sunday morning, our last morning there before we were all going to go home, and we're sitting around the campfire, and they have like those instant pancakes that someone's cooking on over the fire and stuff. And so we're all just kind of sitting around groggily in the morning, eating and talking. And as I'm sitting with a group of kids, I look over, and this kid, we'll call him Bryce. That's his real name. I normally make up a different name, but I don't think any of you guys have ever met him, so we'll call him his real name, Bryce. So I look over and I see Bryce, and he's got a pancake there, and he starts to pour some syrup. And I watch him for a little while. I'm like, wow, he's pouring a lot of syrup on. And I look away. I don't really think much of it. I'm continuing this conversation, and a couple minutes later, I look over, and he's still pouring syrup on his pancake. Like, I look, and he pours. It's like one of these like bottles like this or so, and he pours almost half the bottle onto a single pancake. Like, to say that he put syrup on the pancake is not really honest. Like, he put a little bit of pancake underneath his syrup. And I looked, I was like, Bryce, that's a lot of syrup. He's like, yeah, like, you really like your syrup? I was like, uh-huh. I was like, I think that's too much syrup. Bryce is like, uh-uh. Like, okay. His mom was there and saw him, so I was like, okay, I'm not gonna say anything. But yeah, Bryce, he loved his syrup. He loved making sure he got enough syrup on his pancake. And like, if Bryce, I hope he didn't do that every morning at home, because eventually that would kill him. That's too much syrup. But he loved his syrup. He knew how delicious it was. And that's hopefully similar to how we feel about Jesus. That even if it sometimes seems dangerous to others, we love Jesus, and we want to experience that beautiful, that delicious life with Jesus. Jesus and the disciples, they lived in uncertain, troubling times. The Jewish leaders wanted to kill Jesus and his disciples, and they were successful eventually. We live in uncertain times too. There's things about each of our lives that we don't really know about what's going to happen. The disciples were uncertain about the future, were out of touch with everything Jesus was doing. They didn't get him fully. They didn't understand what Jesus was really about fully with his mission. They didn't understand everything that Jesus would have to go through. They didn't even understand everything that they would have to go through. But yet they trusted that he was working, and they trusted him for who he was, even if they don't understand every single thing about him. And oftentimes for us, we're asked to do the same thing. God doesn't reveal everything to us all the time about what he's doing, about what he's planning to do in our lives. But he wants us to trust that he is still working, that the unseen God is working in unseen ways. But eventually we will see the results of what this God is doing. And eventually he'll become seen again when he comes again. And so Thomas's invitation to follow Jesus, even to death, wasn't just for the other disciples there with Jesus that day, but it's for all of us. We have the opportunity to accept this invitation, choose to follow Jesus, and live life with him, even to the very end of our life, whenever that is. And we have the opportunity to be like Thomas and invite others to follow Jesus, knowing that it's worth it no matter what that means in our lives. Because Jesus sees the bigger picture and still goes through it with us. Because Jesus has the power to wake his friends from the sleep of death, we can accept this invitation from Thomas. Let's go with him, and no matter what, even if we die, know that it's worth it.